We're now going to be assembling our first expert panel, and we've got quite a few people for that. We've also got some questions that we solicited from social media ahead of time to kick it off. So I'm going to give some introductions as we're getting our panel assembled. We've already...
Just one thing here. If you are a speaker on this panel, please start your video now without me asking, because this makes it easier for me to put you on the spotlight.
There we go. So we've already met Chris Gill, and he is going to be one of our experts answering questions. Donald is here now. He just popped in. So let me introduce him. Donald is a familiar face to many of us. He's also got something new going on. He's the founder and director of a nonprofit called the Plato's Academy Center, which is going to be organizing events and raising funds to build an international conference center in the home of philosophy, Athens. So this is going to be very exciting. He's got 2 books coming out next summer on Marcus Aurelius. One is a graphic novel called Verissimus. The other is a prose biography for Yale called Ancient Lives, Marcus Aurelius. I see Sharon is here as well. Sharon Lebell is an author, speaker, and musician, well known for her book, The Art of Living, the classic manual on virtue, happiness, and effectiveness. Her mission is rescuing philosophy from the philosophers, rescuing virtue from the sanctimonious, and rescuing art from the critics. And her fundamental message is the urgency and preciousness of the current moment and the opportunity each of us has to live a life of dignity, grace, and style. I see Gabriel Galluzzo here as well. He is another founding member of the Modern Stoicism project. He teaches ancient philosophy at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, works on ancient metaphysics, mainly Aristotle and the way it has shaped Western thought through the ages, including our modern age. And he's been running workshops. He's one of the people who helps with the management of modern Stoicism. I see Piotr is here as well. Piotr is an author and philosopher based in Warsaw, Poland, and he is primarily known, I think, for his recent proposal in a book that is called Reformed Stoicism, for a Reformed Stoicism updated for the 21st century. There's a manual of Reformed Stoicism, but he also has another book about Stoicism and creativity, something we're going to be hearing about a little bit later, called Does Happiness Write Blank Pages, on Stoicism and artistic creativity. And last but not least, we have John Sellers, teaches philosophy at Royal Holloway, University of London. He is another original member of the Modern Stoicism team. He's also a founder of the London Center for Ancient Philosophy and the recently incorporated Aurelius Foundation as well. He has a number of books, the most recent of which would be The Pocket Stoic, if I'm right, and Lessons in Stoicism, although I may be wrong about that. So we have a number of questions that are going to be coming in soon. I see some already, but I want to begin with one that came in social media, and anybody can feel free to take a stab at it. It's a really basic question. What is good about virtue, and how do we know that? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I want to, Don, you go.
Sure. Yeah, so it's a really good question. And the Stoics give us an argument for why virtue is the one thing that's genuinely good, while everything else isn't. And it's that virtue consistently benefits us, right? So all of those other external things that people might pursue and prefer, like fame, status, money, health, sometimes they benefit us, but sometimes they don't. It all depends how you use them. And how you use them depends on the state of your mind. If you've got lots of money, you can do good things with it. You can do terrible things with it. Whether you do good things with it depends on having an excellent frame of mind. It's the virtuous mind that generates the benefit, not the external thing. And then the Stoics are going to say, well, if you've got money, if you've got status and influence, your virtuous character will enable you to do good things. But if you don't have those things and you're down on your luck, a virtuous character will also enable you to flourish and do well in those bad times. It will always benefit you. There's never a situation in which being virtuous will make things worse.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I would just piggyback on that by saying that virtue contributes to inner coherence. You get a congruence of your thoughts, your words, and your deeds. And that is an express ticket to what we like to call the flourishing life.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah. I think another good thing about the Stoic version of the virtues that they grow with your knowledge. You know, it's not that your knowledge somehow gets stuck and then you make progress with the virtues. I mean, the more you understand, the better you behave, the better you make progress. So, as Sharon was saying, that your personality is unified all the time, is coherent. And I want to include in the notion of knowledge everything that we might possibly know, anything true about the world. So I think it's a very, very consistent idea.
We're getting a lot of other questions about virtue coming in that maybe we can launch into right away and then come back to some of the other questions. So Andre says, to what extent is virtue a teachable thing? And this is something where the Stoics, you know, have devoted a lot of thought to it, and modern Stoics. Go ahead.
I guess we wouldn't be here if virtue wasn't teachable, right? That's one of the premises, that we can and should share this knowledge. So hence Stoicism and hence modern Stoicism, I guess.
It's teachable, but you have to see it for yourself as well. So the two things somehow go together, so that there is the transmission of content, but also someone has to see things for themselves in a way.
Well, there's an experiential aspect.
Yes, I think it's not that, you know, you just learn it. You learn it and you make it your own, so to speak. Sorry, Chris. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, you learn, virtue is learned, but it's learned gradually through what they call oikeiosis, the process of development, ethical development. So it's a combination of learning what virtue is, what virtue and happiness is, and how to realize them, and also learning how to relate properly to other people. There are these two strands, a kind of strand of understanding and a strand of relationship. And so that's what learning is. So teaching is using any resource we can to develop that process. So the process of learning depends on us, but we can learn in all sorts of ways and all sorts of contexts. There are experts, but there's a wise person is the expert, but otherwise all of us have the ability through all the experiences of our life to learn, and have the natural ability to. So it's learning. So I think you can't separate teaching, from learning.
I think it's also worth stressing that they present virtue as a skill or a craft, right? So it's that kind of practical knowledge. It's not just a set of doctrines or a body of information. It's something you learn how to do in the way that you might learn any other skill or practical activity.
I'd like to just add to that, I suppose from my perspective as a psychotherapist, as a cognitive therapist in particular, we would say that the emotional improvement people are aiming at are teachable, they're cognitive. But that doesn't mean that they're easily learned. And it may mean that it requires a considerable amount of effort and study and practice. And those are things that the Stoics emphasize. The Stoics thought the virtue is teachable, but not easily learnable. And to hark to the earlier question as well, the idea that virtue is the only true good is something that the Stoics inherit from Socrates. And the argument for that is articulated in more length in other ancient texts, for example, in the Euthydemus of Plato. And the idea that virtue is teachable also is inherited to some extent from Socrates. But I think the main criticism, incidentally, that Xenophon made of Socrates was that he didn't think he placed enough emphasis on teaching the virtue of self-control to his students. And I think that's something that we can see the Stoics as attempting to rectify, because they place even more emphasis on this particular virtue that allows us to exhibit the other virtues more consistently, and obviously requires practice and training.
So here's two other questions on virtue that I'm going to kind of roll together because I think they're addressing the same question. And I know Sharon has some thoughts on this in particular. What is the difference between classic and modern Stoicism as regards choosing the right virtues? And then another question, are 4 virtues sufficient? How about adding some like tolerance or solidarity? And there's a good bit of discussion going on in the chat where people are pointing out that the Stoics, when they talk about justice, for example, that includes kindness, benevolence, solidarity, things like that. But this is a good thing to, I think, throw out there. And we may have some differences on this. And I'd like to highlight Sharon on this because she talks about the need for thinking about several other virtues, which she calls we virtues. So do you want to, I'm putting you on the spot. Do you want to tackle that?
Sure, I'll give it a go. I recently gave a talk, and I was kind of flying by the seat of my pants, but I had this revelation, is too strong a word, but it occurred to me that the classic virtues in Stoicism, courage, temperance, justice, wisdom, they're self-sufficient, they form a whole, but it occurred to me that they are ultimately self-referential. They are ways that we develop virtue by ourselves, for ourselves, and they can certainly have social entailments, of course they do, but I started to think that maybe in our modern world, we live fundamentally in relationship. That is where we live. And I started to think, well, maybe we need some, what I'm just going to call we virtues. And so I rolled them out, and they are nurturance, liberality, kindness, and altruism. And I have a lot to say about these things, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So I'd really like to hear some other voices, because I know this is kind of a controversial notion to be, to have the temerity to amplify on the ancients.
I'd love to respond to that.
Go for it, guys.
I'd like to agree with Sharon. I mean, I think what Sharon is saying, these are indeed virtues. These are indeed Stoic virtues, but the ancients also thought they were virtues. They were all, they were, because as people have indicated, these 4 virtues aren't 4 out of a larger list. It isn't as if there are, 78 possible virtues, of which they've plucked out 4. These virtues are meant to map all the 4 areas of experience. So wisdom is related to any kind of virtue related to understanding. Justice is any kind of virtue related to relationships with other people. Courage covers another whole area of virtues regarding risk and so forth. And self-control or moderation is everything relating to desire and emotion. So they're a kind of mapping device, and in fact the Stoics sometimes do distinguish lots of sub-virtues, of which liberality, for instance, is a generosity of spirit. That's a sub-virtue of justice, and kindness is picked out often as a positive emotion that you get if you're exercising justice. So I think you're right. I think you're right about Stoicism, Sharon, but also right about ancient Stoicism too. I think they're already, as it were, there.
I wonder if it isn't a matter of emphasis. Does anybody think that? Okay.
I think it's a matter of italicization. Yeah, I mean, it's just the importance of making the caring relational virtues salient. They may be embraced by, as Christopher said so nicely, this kind of fundamental map, but We need caring these days.
I'm going to respond to that. That's okay. And first of all, I agree with everything that Chris said. I think it's important to view these cardinal virtues as schematic, and I think that's definitely how the Stoics understood them. And also, I'm going to disagree slightly with what Sharon has just said, because in the sense that I think kindness, for example, is already emphasized in some of the Stoic texts, and in particular, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius seems to me to emphasize throughout the virtue of kindness. And also, just to kind of emphasize something that we're taking for granted, there's a problem of translation straight up here, which is that some of these ancient Greek words for emotions and virtues are nuanced and form part of a complex system of classification that doesn't neatly translate into modern English or other modern languages. It's always going to be difficult to translate some of these nuanced terms. And in particular, dikaiosune, the Greek word that we translate as justice, which used to be translated as righteousness sometimes, I think would be better translated as social virtue in a broad sense, because it's clear that the Stoics mean more by it than we mean today by justice. And they tell us that it includes fairness, but also kindness towards other people, for example, as an integral component of it. And if you know that, and you look at Marcus Aurelius again, you'll see on almost every other page of the Meditations, he's talking about the risk of anger and of being alienated from our fellow man. For example, in the most famous passage in the Meditations, in 2.1, where he says, every morning when you wake up, tell yourself you're going to meet ungrateful and vicious and intolerant and meddling people. He goes on to say, you know, that the solution is to see them as our kin, as our brothers, and to view ourselves as being part of a larger social whole, and to treat them with kindness and generosity of spirit. So the Meditations, one of the major themes of the Meditations is Marcus trying to avoid anger and alienation from other people, and to counteract it with kindness and acceptance and a sense of unity of the brotherhood of man.
Here's an interesting point to then add into this. We keep getting this question over and over and over again, you know, about don't we need more than the four virtues? And you know, maybe there's something in the way that they're presented that leads itself to easy misunderstandings. You know, you see all these schemas, right, where people want to line everything in Stoicism up, the three disciplines and the virtues and this and that, and they only name those four. Do we have a sort of communication problem then, do you think? Or
maybe four's too many, Greg. Maybe we only need one.
I mean, I think
go ahead, Gabriel.
Has something to do also with the way they classify these things. I mean, which is a bit weird perhaps for us, but if you compare them to Aristotle, another virtue theorist, I mean, Aristotle classifies the virtues in relation to the sphere of application, could be feelings, emotions, whatever. So he has different virtues, say, for different sphere of application. But the Stoics don't go this way. They give you the headings, so to speak, and then you have to reconstruct what falls under these things by means of somehow analysis, conceptual analysis. And then if you go that way, you see that kindness, caring, and many other things fall under one or another of those. I mean, these are in some sense the generating virtues, the ones that generate the other things. I mean, obviously today we might prefer, in some sense, to have a more explicit way of classifying them. I mean, like, for instance, Aristotle's could be taken to be, but I think, I mean, everything is included in a way. If you go down, if you analyze these virtues, it's not, I mean, these are just headings in a way, I think. Generating virtues, let's put it like that.
The idea of having just one virtue, as Donald said, is quite appalling, I think, and it's getting some traction in the chat box, I see. And I guess it would be simply called virtue, right? Virtue as in with capital V. And the entire conversation would be shifted into interpretation of how it works in specific contexts and specific circumstances. But on the other hand, speaking for myself, I'm of course idea of amplifying Stoicism is not alien to me, needless to say. So yeah, this is a very promising line of thought, I guess.
I'm going to introduce some potential additional heterodoxy within the whole virtue thing, because one of the questions that we got a follow-up about virtue is, here we go. This is from Alexander. Shouldn't we say we can teach the competencies that are helpful to become virtuous, but we can't teach virtue? There's no gradual process towards virtue. You are either virtuous or not. See Cicero's Stoic paradoxes. Now, this is a sticking point. You see Seneca kind of compromising on this in quite a few of his letters. It is one of the Stoic paradoxes. Do we as modern Stoics say, well, virtue is like an on-off switch. Either you got it or you don't. And if you're not virtuous, you're vicious, which is a common presentation. Or do we see it something more like a rheostat, a dimmer, where there's a continuum? What do you, I know what I think about that, but what do the rest of you think?
Well, from my point of view, the Stoics do talk, they talk a lot about progress, and there are accounts of progress. There are accounts Cicero has two accounts of progress, one about the growth in understanding, gradual growth in understanding, and another in gradual growth in relationships. And we have similar kinds of scales, patterns with emotions. But I think the reason, what the Stoics don't think is that we can map these things in a kind of mechanical, external way, so that we can say about other people, oh well, he's just got to level 2, whereas I'm at virtue level 3. They don't think that, and actually they're right. Virtue isn't like that, and I think what the Stoics really are thinking is that what the Stoics are very interested in is not so much labeling and judging people, but urging them and encouraging them to become virtuous. So Stoicism is a kind of what's sometimes called first personal. It addresses each of us, and it asks each of us to do all we can to become virtuous. And so that's I think why they put it very simply. They're really emphasizing that none of us are perfect. We're all making progress, but that is true. we aren't perfect. We are trying. So I think it's unrealistic and rather unhelpful to suggest that virtue is something that can be mapped out in a very kind of mechanical, numerical kind of way.
I think one of the things is the Stoic concerned about, just to amplify what Chris said, is a kind of complacency that would come from believing that we're virtuous enough.
Yes. And other people are not.
Yeah. And any other, I think, Piotr, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, but it was kind of like 2 steps back. My idea was quite simple, that we can talk about virtue as in certain either or ideal construct, but as Stoic progressors, we need a learning curve. We need a path that we may be getting on. So and this is something I've, in my personal experience with Stoicism, which works quite fine. That the virtue is this kind of aspirational ideal that is somewhere there, and I basically know that I will never get there fully, but still it kind of points me in the right direction, and it kind of on the practical level it works.
If we say that either we're virtuous and maybe we're not virtuous, or we're vicious, does that risk discouraging people? I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, if I recognize myself as partly vicious, then I can pay attention to the things I need to work on, and it's good for me to be realistic about that. But maybe for beginners, doesn't that risk almost paralyzing them at the start? Oh, I'll never make any progress. What do the rest of you think?
So, I take it that all of us can do the right thing in a particular situation. All of us get it right from time to time, right? So the goal is to consistently get it right, to always do the right thing, to turn those occasional virtuous acts into habits. So we're habitually doing the right thing. So to play devil's advocate a minute and argue against what Chris was saying earlier, perhaps we can count this, right? Because someone would be perfectly virtuous, someone would be the ideal sage if they never made a mistake. Our goal is to make fewer mistakes. So there's a sense in which you could give people a score, right? The person that makes fewer mistakes because their virtuous behavior is fully better ingrained in their character is going to be closer to perfection than someone who's really inconsistent and doesn't manage it very often.
I just want to add as a kind of aside that the seriousness of a vice might be more obvious depending on external circumstances. So, for example, I don't know, if I get in a taxi and the cab driver's kind of railing about his strong prejudices and political opinions, and if he ruled the world, he'd do this and that, it might kind of seem trivial in a way, like he's just kind of venting. But if he was president of the United States and he suddenly had all of this power, what seems like a trivial vice in one nation might have much more serious consequences in another. So it's hard sometimes for people to gauge their level of virtue or vice until they find themselves in a situation that puts it to the test. And I think that ties in perhaps with what John was saying about being able to act more consistently across a range of situations in a virtuous manner.
Aaron, were you about to say something?
I also think that, you know, sometimes we have this very negative view of the progress. I mean, somehow, I mean, as if, I mean, obviously it's laborious, it's difficult in some sense, but at the same time, I think the Stoics must have thought that consistency is enjoyable. I mean, the more your opinions fall into the right place, so to speak, the more you get.
Oh, we've lost.
I think Gabrielle may be a bit frozen.
We have to accept this stoically, unfortunately.
Indeed.
Unfortunately.
Sharon, did you have something?
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can now, I think.
Yes, I was saying the consistency is something that is enjoyable. I mean, comes the more your opinions and beliefs fall into the right place, the more natural, the more sort of effortless your actions are. And so in a way, it's not just out of duty or difficult. There must have been something, say, subjectively good as well in progress. So I don't think it's just that. Sorry.
Very good.
Now, from the, in a way, practical perspective, because there was the question, does this idea of either or nothing, all or everything, all or nothing type of virtue, does it put people off from Stoicism? Is it kind of discouraging? In my experience, when I work with people who are trying to learn and more about Stoicism, train themselves and kind of try out that path, it is not discouraging. I mean, people kind of realize quite well that virtue is certain kind of ideal that we should head towards, but it's not kind of discouraging. It's not putting people off. People kind of understand much more than we think, I guess, that there is this kind of idealistic approach here, and it's not discouraging, at least with people I work with.
I think you can have an ideal that none of us attain to and that we all work towards, as long as there are things that you can advise people to do, or you can advise yourself to do.
Yeah, for example.
And the Stoics are very rich in different kinds of advice about things you can do. I mean, Marcus, for instance, in first book of the Meditations, talks about how you can learn from other people. And he lists all the specific things he learnt from other people. So, and the Stoics are, full of guidance of that kind. What I meant by saying you don't have different levels is that they don't think it's all cut and dried, and also they're not very interested in judging people and saying, you've only reached level 1, 2, or 3. but I certainly think they think there are a lot of things things you can do, things we can all do, things we can advise other people to do. But I think you're right, Piotr. I think people can accept the idea that perfection is difficult to attain. And how many people can put their hand on their heart and say, I may not have all the virtues, but at least I've got this virtue. I mean, are there really people who are happy to say that of themselves?
I'm not.
I think not. Nobody's really happy with. Nobody really would. I mean, nobody of good judgment, let's say, would say that.
And another way to read the Stoic comments about the rarity of the sage and the difficulty of virtue is that they're simply saying, "Hey, don't worry, nobody's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
We're all here in our imperfection. So the beginner ought not to beat themselves up too much about this."
So that leads to a different direction of a question, one that we got through social media a few days ago, and it has to do with Epictetus's Enchiridion 5, where the person who's making real progress and is kind of, at a good point, they blame neither others nor themselves. And the person says, well, how do you get to this stage of not blaming yourself or others? What does that look like?
That's surely a difficult part, I guess.
I think it depends what blaming means. I mean, if blaming, if that doesn't mean you don't work at it or criticize your methodology, but just blaming, that negative response is wrong and it's misguided. So I think that's the point, really. It doesn't mean that you're not trying to find better ways of doing something. You're challenging yourself, but not blaming yourself.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, but I guess maybe this is a kind of a straightforward answer here, but the dichotomy of control, the analysis of what is up to you and what is not up to you in a given situation is kind of a easy solution, I guess. I mean, it kind of clearly defines that your own actions, values, goals, and so on, and moral decisions are in your control. And what the others do, it's not in your control. So in a way, it is as simple as that. Of course, kind of applying this into a real life situation when someone is annoying me actively and so on, it's tricky. But I guess the basics are quite simple.
Sorry, John.
To ask would be, why does anyone feel the need to blame someone or something for a particular event? If something happens, it is what it is part of the order of events in nature. Where does blame have to come into it? I mean, I always thought that line in Epictetus was just sort of intuitively obvious. I didn't have any great problem with it. I thought, absolutely, you definitely want to get to a place where you're not looking for someone to point the finger at. That's surely a good place to be.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to weigh in on it? Or
I'd agree with most of what you said already. I think there are several aspects, and there's also this issue of what we actually mean by blame, as to just holding someone accountable. Blame implies annoyance, I think. So we should ask ourselves, is it worth being annoyed? And also, are we talking about events in the past, which are by definition beyond our direct control? And then there's the issue of, why do people do things? People do things because they believe that it's the right thing to do at the time. No man does evil knowingly or willingly, according to Socrates and Marcus Aurelius. So I think I agreed with John, actually. It seems intuitively obvious to me that blame is pointless and also one of the toxic emotions, and it's not necessary for moral accountability either.
So shifting again, here's another question that I think everyone will have something to say about. I have a friend that often uses Stoicism and the dichotomy of control in particular to justify or excuse behavior. For example, withholding communication or affection and then saying the problem is the other person's desires. is there, here's the real question, such a thing as misuse of Stoicism? I see a lot of nodding heads.
I mean, there is misuse of where we accept the virtues.
It's the nature of just about any ism, I think, to be misused. It just all depends on the direction of our efforts and our strivings, and we want to put those pointed toward virtue. But oh, sure, of course.
I think one other thing one could emphasize, I think, in line with what Sharon was saying. I mean, it's not. I don't think that when we say someone else's desires might be wrong, must be wrong. I don't think the Stoics saw that as some sort of subjective judgment based on our prejudices or stereotypes or whatever. I mean, they thought that this came somehow from a deep consideration and finally understanding of our human nature. So it's not that someone might just come up and say you're wrong because your desires are not in the right place, and then I don't think it's as subjective as well, so to speak. It comes from an understanding of what we are. So I think the misuse is there because the assumptions there are not correct.
Mm-hmm. This relates to the conversation we've had, because Stoics acknowledge that none of us are perfectly wise, and from that inevitably follows that all Stoics are going to be imperfectly Stoic and to some extent misinterpreting the philosophy, including Zeno.
Yeah, that's what I meant. It's not the misuse of Stoicism as such, but the misunderstanding of Stoicism. It's etc. Unless, I mean, obviously, I don't want to say. From the Stoic point of view, then obviously all ideas are questionable in a way. But I think from the Stoic point of view, there will be misunderstanding of the doctrine. Yeah.
Now, from my point of view, one of the misunderstandings or the misuses of Stoicism, as the question put it, is that some people, at least in my experience, some people tend to somehow convert Stoicism or misuse Stoicism as this kind of ego project, kind of overly focusing on oneself. I, me, myself, only this perspective. So from this point of view, this kind of refers to me to what Sharon said about the we virtues. We can kind of, have a conversation about what kind of what kindness is, or what those we virtues are exactly. But this is the line of thought that kind of saves us from this particular misuse of Stoicism. It shouldn't be kind of this ego project, but the kind of application to the social relationship with others needs to be there. And this is one of the key points from my point of view.
Yeah, and I think there's an issue here about taking ideas out of context. So you could take a particular Stoic idea like the dichotomy of control out of context and misuse it. But Stoicism is a really complex set of ideas, and you need all of the different bits of the jigsaw in place to really understand what's going on. So that might be one idea. Then there's ideas about virtue and indifference. There's ideas about the emotions. There's the idea about our natural affinity and social instinct to help other people. You need all of those bits of the jigsaw together. If you take any one of those on its own out of context, then you could quite easily do some unstoic things with it.
I wonder, when it comes to this particular idea, the dichotomy of control, if it doesn't perhaps lend itself to misuse more easily than some of the other ideas. For example, our nature being a social nature, or that we should concentrate on the virtues. I mean, I think somebody could misuse those as well, but it strikes me, and maybe I'm totally wrong on this, so I'd like to see what everyone else has to say, that the dichotomy of control is one of the easiest ones to misuse and just focus on yourself in a way and say, well, that's nothing to me, right? And then to also misuse by when other people are clearly suffering and they're not Stoics, to go up to them and say, hey, have you heard about this Stoicism thing? This stuff's in your control, this stuff's not in your control. And it's a way of being kind of standoffish with them or placing too much on them. So I'd be interested to hear what the rest of you have to think about that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe they're all equally abusable.
It's also an idea in Epictetus, right? Is it a core idea in Stoic ethics? He asks provocatively.
Indeed.
It's not necessarily there in our summaries of early Stoic ethics.
Yeah.
It's not particularly pronounced in Cicero or Seneca. It's something specific to Epictetus. So, one thing that you see a lot in modern Stoicism are ideas and concepts in, say, Epictetus or Seneca, which might be unique and idiosyncratic to them, just presented as core Stoic ideas. They're ideas presented by a Stoic. That doesn't automatically make them Stoic ideas. So I think we could complicate this quite a lot, I think.
Yeah, yes, I think one of the other things we've been discussing, the idea of the fundamental nature of virtue to happiness, and the importance of the virtues and so on. These don't only occur in one thinker, they occur in all the thinkers. And it is quite true that the dichotomy of control is only in Epictetus. And so it really only makes sense, I think, if we connect it, if we're able to connect it, and there are different ways of connecting it, with ideas that do occur in all the other thinkers. So I think that is a really important point about the dichotomy of control that John's made.
That's a
I think
fair
John
point,
is
yeah.
John is right that this up to us, not up to us things seem to appear in other authors who are not Stoic.
Aristotle, for instance.
I mean, or roughly the same age as Epictetus or a bit later, Porphyry. I mean, belonging to the Neoplatonic tradition. I mean, it's a topic of the age, so to speak. It must come from somewhere, but not necessarily the core idea.
Well, we have about another 3 minutes left for the panel, which is probably not enough to handle another question. Any final thoughts from any of you on any of these matters that we've hashed out so far? It's your opportunity for the last word.
Well, no, I think John is absolutely right about trying to put everything together. I think that's and I think this comes out in this point about the dichotomy of control. It's very easy, especially when you're learning about Stoicism, just to find one thing and think that is the key. But it's not like that. It is a matter of trying to put things together. And that helps one to understand what the progress is. Progress is a matter of trying to put these different ideas and different kinds of experience and different kinds of response together. And as Sharon reminds us, it's a matter not just of us, of what's important about me, but about connecting and relating and caring. So I think it's this putting together is absolutely crucial to learning about Stoicism.
I guess you made a good final statement for all of us.
Well,
I can concur.
I'm trying to have the last word.
I mean, one thing just to add to that is that with the three famous Roman Stoics, they all have their own unique characters and they emphasize different things. And I've met many people in the modern Stoic community, some people who will say Epictetus is their favorite and they can't stand Seneca. Other people will fall in love with Marcus Aurelius. Other people will really like Seneca. And that's great. The range of these different voices that stress different aspects means that if you read one and you don't quite connect with them, you might find another who will become a firm favorite. And I think that's part of the broad appeal of Stoicism today, that you've got these different voices and personalities that you can connect with.
That is a great point to go out on. So let's thank our panel of experts here assembled for you at Stoicon. And
Thank you.
up next is going to be Catherine Koromillis. So we've got a little bit of juggling things around. And thanks so much to all of you for contributing to this. And thanks to everybody who is asking questions as well.